June 19, 1944, 09:30. 22,000 feet above the blue-on-blue hush of the Philippine Sea, sun hammered the aluminum skins of Grumman F6F Hellcats and the lacquered noses of Mitsubishi Zeros into a glare that made every pilot squint behind his visor. The carrier deck noise, a diesel thrum, the distant chatter of men in life jackets, the metallic cough of catapults, had long since been replaced by the thin, high ring of air through propeller tips. Up here, only the instruments, the wind, and the steady tick of the guns break the silence between confidence and panic. Lieutenant James Jimmy O'Neill, USNR, checked his canopy seal with a gloved hand and felt the breath of the engine through the fuselage. A steady, dependable growl from the Pratt Whitney two-row radial that made the Hellcat feel like a living thing beneath him. He had flown Wildcats and Wildcats' cousins before. The Hellcat felt different. Heavier, he'd thought at first, sluggish in the roll when he'd practiced in the morning over the carrier Enterprise. The Japanese pilots had laughed when American flyers first described the airplane. Clumsy, he'd heard. Too slow to dance with a zero. The ogling, the comments over coffee on the carrier, the bets between pilots, they all contributed to a small, stubborn doubt tucked behind his ribs. Beside him, Lieutenant Commander Harold Hawk Mackenzie, a veteran with a weathered jaw and an English lilt earned from too many briefings, thumbed the switch on his gun sight and called out numbers. His voice came over the intercom, steady as a metronome. "Jimmy, 9 o'clock high. 2 bogies, banded with light paint. Stay loose, energy first." Hawk's hand pointed without moving. In the thin light, the Zero looked small and almost delicate, a toy against the ocean. The Japanese formation, a braided string of silver and green, hung like schoolchildren in the distance. For years, American pilots had been taught to fear the Zero's graceful turn, its superior climb at light weight, the stories of aces who fought in its cockpit with reckless virtuosity. But radios crackled and intelligence memos had a new, quieter refrain. The Hellcat was no dancing partner to the Zero's pirouette. It was a hunter built to eat clumsy choreography for breakfast. The discrepancy between myth and metal sat in every pilot's throat like brine. O'Neill glanced down at his instruments. Manifold pressure, RPMs, oil temp, all steady. He watched his hands, the calluses on the heel of his palm, the way the stick quivered when he tightened his fingers. He remembered the first time he'd taxied the Hellcat, how it tugged, how the cockpit swallowed him, how its broad chord wing felt like a promise between takeoff and landing. He hated that promise when he imagined the Zero in his 6. The first contact was sudden. Radar on the carrier had pinged the incoming raid, and formations were vectored to intercept. The sky filled, not with the balletic spirals the textbooks predicted, but with a ragged, brutal speed. Zeros peeled in and out with terrifying quickness. American escort fighters sliced toward them with a single-minded hunger. Shell casings in O'Neill's fuselage clicked like rain. The sweet smell of gun oil and the acrid snap of cordite filled the cockpit when he ran the guns hot in a check. Sweat trickled down his back despite the cool of altitude. When the first round stitched the air, the Hellcat's heavier frame and powerful engine showed its teeth. O'Neill felt the surge when he opened the throttle. The F6F leapt forward with a shove that wasn't elegant, but it was devastating. The Hellcat didn't need to outturn a Zero in a gentle ballet. It needed to trade speed for position and punish mistakes. In the first brief, fragile dogfight of the day, that trade revealed itself. A Zero who trusted his turn would find himself flattened by a Hellcat's dive, and flattened again by 50 caliber concentration. The cockpit filled with the tiny mechanical sounds of battle, the whine of gyros, the seek of the gun sight, the cough as shells ate through an enemy wing. A Zero exploded in a spray of oil and cloth like a struck wasp. The sight was less cinematic than O'Neill had imagined. It was raw, immediate. The enemy plane mushroomed, falling into a sheet of white smoke and leaving behind a thin black trail. For a heartbeat, the sky smelled of something metallic and hot. O'Neill's hands tightened. He had both the taste of triumph and the weight of inevitability pressing on him. Around him, other Hellcats were punching through, and their yells came through the radio in quick stabs. 1 down! 2 down! The laughter he'd heard on the carrier was gone, replaced by a grim, efficient cadence. Below, the blue of the sea seemed endless, an indifferent witness. The carrier, a tiny square among leviathans, launched and recovered wingmen who had been ugly close to death. Onboard aviation machinists and radio men tracked the tally. Each Hellcat that returned had a story written in shrapnel and sweat. The pilots who had once derided the plane's sluggishness were recalibrating quickly, voice by voice, kill by kill. It wasn't slick handling or graceful turns that mattered here. It was power, armor, fire concentration, and tactics that let pilots convert speed into lethal geometry. When the engagement ended, the sky settled back into an almost biblical calm. The Hellcats, black with exhaust and dotted with bullet holes, stretched their wings and cruised home. The air was thick with the knowledge that the old lessons had to be relearned, that myths about Japanese invincibility did not match the accounting of steel and fuel. Somewhere between the thunder of the guns and the thin finalities of parachutes opening, a new confidence was being forged. Not boastful, but hard-edged and factual. Jimmy O'Neill didn't laugh. He sat for a long while with the headset off, listening to the ocean, feeling the plane beneath him as if for the first time. He thought about the men in the broken axes and about the warning in the engines. Speed and attitude, not elegance, would win this fight. He unfastened his lap, felt the harness slacken, and prepared for the long glide home to the carrier, where the tally would be taken and the truth of the day would be counted, a truth that would swell into a ratio. A legend Hellcats, it would come to be said, turned the sky against the zero. Bethpage, Long Island, early 1942. The air outside Grumman's sprawling factory smelled of oil, metal, and nervous determination. Inside, the plant buzzed like a living organism. Drills screamed, hammers rang, and the echo of boots over concrete stitched the soundtrack of wartime invention. Engineers bent over drafting tables that glowed with the blue ghost light of plans. Coffee cups trembled as the tremors of rivet guns shook the walls. At the center of this storm stood Leroy Grumman, a compact man with a stern jaw and a mind that refused to rest. Around him, a handful of men, Jake Swerble, Bob Hall, and William Schwendler, traced lines across paper that would soon become the bones of the Navy's next generation of fighter aircraft. They knew the stakes. Reports from the Pacific were grim. American Wildcats were being shredded by Japanese Mitsubishi A6M Zeros. The Zero could outturn, outclimb, and outmaneuver nearly everything the U.S. Navy could put in the air. Its pilots, veterans of China and Pearl Harbor, were masters of aerial knife fighting, and their planes were designed for it. Light, agile, stripped of armor, and built for the art of the kill. Grumman's engineers didn't just want to match the Zero. They wanted to build its opposite, a machine that turned the Japanese fighters' strengths into weaknesses, speed and survivability, Grumman said one night, leaning over the draft table. His hand rested on the pencil marks that outlined a huge engine cowling, wide enough to house the Pratt Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a 2,000-horsepower monster that had already proven itself in the F-4U Corsair. "If the Zero dances," he muttered, "we'll hit like a hammer." The idea was simple. Build a plane that didn't need to outturn, only to outlast and outhit. The F6F Hellcat would be bigger, heavier, and brutally efficient. It would climb with power, dive with vengeance, and shrug off the hits that turned other aircraft into scrap. When the first prototype, the XF6F1, rolled out of the hangar in June 1942, the sunlight gleamed off its navy blue fuselage. The men stood around it like blacksmiths examining their first forged blade. Bob Hall, Grumman's chief test pilot, climbed into the cockpit, his flight suit zipped tight against the summer air. The big propeller spun, coughing to life with a throaty rumble that shook the hangar doors. On takeoff, the aircraft lumbered down the strip like a bear rising from slumber. But when Hall pulled the stick back, the bear leapt, surprisingly graceful once its paws left the ground. The Double Wasp engine roared like thunder as it climbed through 5,000 feet, then 10,000. The Hellcat's wings flexed in the sun. Its wide undercarriage made it a natural on carrier decks. Hall's voice came over the radio, calm and clipped. "Gentlemen, she's got claws." But Grumman wasn't satisfied. The first prototype used the Wright R2600 engine, underpowered. The Zero could still outclimb it. So Grumman ordered an upgrade before the Navy could even finish evaluating it. Within weeks, the XF6F3 was fitted with the Double Wasp, and the transformation was immediate. The Hellcat went from capable to ferocious. Test flights showed speeds over 370 mph, a service ceiling of 37,000 feet, and climb rates that erased the Zero's edge. But most importantly, it could take punishment. The fuselage was reinforced. Self-sealing fuel tanks and armor plate were added around the cockpit. In tests, engineers shot holes through its wings and fuselage. The Hellcat limped home every time. One Navy observer wrote in his report, "This is the first aircraft that feels like it was built by sailors. Tough, reliable, and mean." By August 1942, the Navy was ready to order it straight into production. Grumman's factory in Bethpage worked around the clock. Workers, many of them women, riveted panels until their hands bled. Each plane rolled out painted deep navy blue, its wings folded neatly upward like a bird at rest. In the mess halls, engineers joked that the Hellcat was a wildcat after eating 3 wildcats. It wasn't graceful, but it was lethal, and Grumman himself loved that about it. He'd point to the aircraft's thick landing gear and grin. "You can drop that thing onto a carrier like a sack of coal," he'd say, "and she'll still fly tomorrow." When the first operational F6F3s were delivered to VF9 aboard the USS Essex in early 1943, the pilots raised eyebrows. Compared to the sleek Zero, the Hellcat looked, well, fat. The Japanese would soon mock it, calling it a flying bathtub. They laughed in their briefings, convinced the Americans had built something too slow, too heavy to challenge them. But as the Hellcat squadrons trained, something became clear. The aircraft's bulk was deceptive. It rolled faster than expected, dove like a rock, and climbed like a homesick angel when handled right. Its .650 caliber Browning machine gun spat death at a range that made the Zero's lighter armament look quaint. By the spring of 1943, the Hellcat was ready. The Pacific skies, once dominated by the white-painted wings of the rising sun, were about to meet a new kind of storm. August 31st, 1943, off the coast of Marcus Island. The sea below glowed faintly under the morning sun, a mirror of molten silver cut by the shadows of carrier task groups steaming in formation. On the deck of USS Yorktown CV-10, aircrews moved with clockwork precision, chalking mission numbers on fuselages, securing wing locks, and tightening the harness straps of men who knew what combat debut meant. The air trembled with the roar of Grumman F6F3 Hellcats warming up, their Pratt Whitney double wasps coughing, spitting smoke, then settling into a deep, throaty growl. The sound was physical. You felt it in your ribs before you heard it. Lieutenant William Billy Dean, VF-5 Squadron, sat in his cockpit and glanced at the calendar taped beside his compass. It was marked with a thick pencil circle. August 31st, strike on Marcus. He had been training with the Hellcat for weeks now, and though he trusted her strength, he had yet to trust her luck. Over the intercom, the deck officer's voice barked through the static. "Pilots, you are cleared to engage. Targets, Japanese airfield and interceptors inbound. Let's see what your new toys can do." Billy cracked a grin beneath his oxygen mask. "Aye, aye, sir." With a lurch and a hiss of steam, the Hellcat catapulted from the deck. The sudden acceleration slammed him back in his seat. The deck vanished and sky filled the canopy. Within seconds, the strike group formed up. Avengers, Dauntlesses, and the new Hellcats weaving in protective arcs. Below, the Pacific rolled endlessly, broken only by white wakes and the faint smudge of islands on the horizon. The first contact came just after 0930. Radar calls came in. Bandits, bearing 080, Angels 15. Billy felt the tension rise through the radio net, voices tightening, breathing shortening. Tiny dots appeared against the glare, then resolved into the pale wings and red discs of A6M Zeros climbing fast. "Let's dance," someone muttered. The Zeros came in clean and confident, their pilots still believing the Americans were flying Wildcats, those slower, underpowered predecessors that had fallen in droves during the early Pacific campaigns. The Japanese rolled effortlessly, closing distance with their traditional tactic. A head-on pass followed by a vertical loop to pull behind the enemy. But this time, the Americans didn't turn. Billy shoved the throttle forward and felt the Hellcat surge. The Zero flashed past, but when its pilot tried to climb into a loop, the Hellcat simply outpaced him, arcing into a dive that turned altitude into raw speed. The Zero stalled in its vertical, too light, too slow to chase. Billy's sight found it in a heartbeat. He squeezed the trigger. 6 50-caliber Brownings erupted in a wall of fire. The sound was less a burst than a continuous thunderclap. Brass casings streamed from the wings, glinting as they fell. The tracers found the Zero's fuselage, walked across its tail, and in a heartbeat the aircraft disintegrated into a blossom of smoke and flame. "Splash one!" Billy shouted, his voice cracking through the radio. All around, the same pattern repeated. The Hellcats didn't duel. They ambushed, climbed, and struck like hammers. The Japanese formation, expecting slow, fragile targets, suddenly faced aircraft that could dive faster and climb almost as quickly. The Zero's legendary maneuverability meant little when every roll ended with a burst of 50-caliber fire. Lieutenant Bob Burnett, covering Billy's wing, shouted over the radio, "Christ, these things take hits like tanks. He nicked my right wing and I barely felt it." Indeed, the Hellcat's armor turned out to be its secret weapon. In earlier years, a single incendiary round could ignite an American plane's fuel tank. Now pilots were coming back with stories of taking cannon hits, landing safely, and patching up for the next sortie. By 1100, the air battle above Marcus Island was decided. Japanese pilots broke formation, diving away in scattered retreat. The Hellcats formed back into groups, some with paint scorched from near misses, others streaked with oil but still flying straight. When Billy's wheels touched the deck again, he cut the engine and just sat there breathing, sweat running down his neck. A deckhand scrambled up to mark his kill count, one red rising sun circle painted under the canopy. Billy climbed out, knees shaking as the ship's loudspeakers announced preliminary tallies. 30 Zeros down, 16 Hellcats lost, most to flak, not enemy fighters. The ratio wasn't yet legendary, but it was the beginning. The beginning of a pattern that would grow, engagement after engagement, into a statistic that defied belief. 19 kills for every Hellcat lost. That evening, on the Yorktown's deck, pilots gathered under the glow of floodlights. Cigarettes flickered like fireflies in the dark. Someone joked that the Japanese would start calling the Hellcat the Blue Death. Billy stared at the sea and said quietly, "They won't laugh much longer." He was right, because within months, the skies over the Pacific would turn into a graveyard of Zero wings and rising sun insignias, and the Hellcat would rise as the new ruler of the air. June 19, 1944. The Philippine Sea. At dawn, the horizon burned crimson over the flat expanse of the Pacific. The Japanese mobile fleet, 4 carriers strong, steamed eastward, its decks crowded with Zero fighters and bomb-laden Judy and Jill dive bombers. Their target, the U.S. Fifth Fleet under Admiral Raymond Spruance, covering the American invasion of the Mariana Islands. But waiting for them, prowling the air above Task Force 58, was the largest and most lethal carrier fighter force ever assembled, nearly 400 F6F Hellcats. They called it Operation Ago, Japan's last desperate attempt to stop the American advance across the Pacific. To the Japanese pilots, it was the chance for redemption. To the Americans, it would become something else entirely. A slaughter, so one-sided that history would remember it by a grim nickname, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Aboard USS Lexington, Lieutenant Alex Tex Vrasiu, one of the Navy's rising aces, climbed into his Hellcat and adjusted his gun sight. He'd scored 12 kills so far, calm, deliberate, always patient in the hunt. Today, though, the air felt heavy. Reports said Japanese carrier groups were launching over 300 aircraft. "Gentlemen," his flight leader radioed, "this is the big one. Let's make it count." Engines screamed to life in unison. The Hellcats roared down the deck, wings slicing the humid air, launching in waves that glittered under the morning sun. At 10 hours, radar aboard USS Enterprise lit up with dozens of blips approaching fast. Controllers barked coordinates. The interceptors scrambled. Tex and his division climbed through 20,000 feet, the Pacific gleaming below them like glass. Then, contact. Black specks appeared on the horizon, growing larger by the second. Japanese Yokosuka D4Y Judy dive bombers, escorted by swarms of Zeros. The Hellcats moved in, high and fast. Vrasiu dove first, cutting through the formation like a blade. His guns flashed. A Judy erupted in fire, spiraling into the sea. He rolled, lined up another, fired again. A second bomber burst into a cloud of black smoke. Within minutes, he'd downed 6 aircraft, 6 kills in 8 minutes. Below him, the sky was chaos. Trails of smoke crisscrossed through cotton clouds, parachutes drifted toward the sea, and burning wrecks spiraled downward. Over the radio, American voices shouted, laughed, and cursed in disbelief. Christ almighty, they're falling like flies. Keep your energy, don't turn with them. Splash 3, splash 4. The Japanese pilots fought with desperation. They tried the same tactics that had worked in 1941 and 1942. Sharp turns, climbing spirals, tight rolls. But the Hellcats refused to play their game. They stayed fast, diving through the enemy in boom and zoom attacks, a vertical dance the Zero couldn't match. The Zero's legendary agility was now its curse. Its light frame couldn't withstand high-speed dives or the heavy 50 caliber rounds the Hellcat spat in torrents. One burst from the Hellcat's 6 guns could pour nearly 72 pounds of lead per second, enough to rip wings apart or detonate fuel tanks in an instant. Above the carnage, Tex Vrasiu's cool voice cut through the radio. They're breaking. All units, stay high. Pick 'em off as they climb. By noon, the air battle had become lopsided beyond imagination. American controllers on the carriers watched radar screens go blank. Enemy blips simply vanished. In the space of a few hours, the Japanese had lost over 300 aircraft. When the last Hellcat landed, deck crews counted bullet holes, patched oil leaks, and painted kill markings. Pilots stepped out drenched in sweat, their flight suits stinking of cordite and adrenaline. They were exhausted, but the realization was dawning. Almost every pilot had scored at least 1 kill. Some had scored 5 or more. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commander of Task Force 58, surveyed the flight deck that evening. Rows of Hellcats gleamed, under the orange glow of sunset, sturdy, oil-stained, and proud. He turned to his aide and muttered, "They can call it whatever they want. I call it a massacre." The final tally stunned the world. Japan lost 476 aircraft in one day. American losses? 20 Hellcats. The pilots who once mocked the Hellcat's bulk and simplicity now called it their guardian angel. It had proven itself not just a match for the Zero, but the weapon that ended its reign. That night, as the fleet sailed westward, the ocean burned with the reflections of distant fires. The Japanese carriers, Taiho, Shokaku, and Hiyo, were hit and sinking, victims of torpedoes and chaos. The Empire's air power had been shattered, and above the silent Pacific, the Hellcat's silhouette, broad, blunt, and indomitable, ruled the sky. Late 1944. The Philippines, the once proud Japanese Zero, the terror of the early Pacific, now limped into battle like a wounded relic. What had once been a symbol of dominance was now a desperate instrument, flown by boys barely out of training. Fuel was scarce. Engines coughed and sputtered on takeoff. Ammunition was rationed to the last belt, and overhead, the Hellcat prowled. The U.S. Navy's carriers, Essex, Bunker Hill, Enterprise, Lexington, and others, fanned across the ocean like floating fortresses. From their decks, squadrons of blue-painted Hellcats launched daily, sweeping the skies clean before the bombers ever arrived. Their engines, that deep throaty rumble of the Pratt Whitney double wasp, had become the new sound of American air supremacy. Lieutenant David McCampbell, commander of Air Group 15 aboard the USS Essex, embodied that dominance. Known for his calm manner and surgical precision, McCampbell led by quiet example. On October 24, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, he etched his name into history. At 0730, radar picked up a massive inbound raid, over 60 Japanese aircraft heading for the fleet. McCampbell and his wingman, Ensign Roy Rushing, scrambled in their Hellcats to intercept. But as they climbed, the scale of the enemy formation came into view. Zeros, Oscars, and Judys, layered in loose formation, sunlight glinting off their canopies. 2 men against 60. McCampbell's voice came through calm as ever. "Looks like the whole Japanese Air Force, Roy. Let's go introduce ourselves." For 90 minutes, the 2 Hellcats tore into the formation like wolves in a flock of sheep. McCampbell dove, fired, climbed, and dove again, never lingering, never turning with a zero. The sky filled with fireballs. Smoke trailed down like gray ribbons into the sea. When it was over, McCampbell had downed 9 enemy aircraft in a single mission, the highest number by any U.S. pilot in one sortie. His total would rise to 34 by war's end. Elsewhere, across the Pacific, the same pattern repeated. Every engagement turned into a rout. In the skies above the Bonans, Formosa, and Okinawa, Hellcats carved through Japanese formations with surgical precision. The Zero's earlier advantages, its nimble turn, its climb rate, meant nothing against pilots who refused to play its game. The Hellcat's doctrine was simple and brutally effective. Don't turn with a zero. Use altitude, use speed, use power. Attack, climb, repeat. Veterans called it the Grumman gospel, and it worked over and over again. By 1945, the Hellcat had achieved the unthinkable, a kill ratio of 19-1. That number wasn't a fluke. It was the arithmetic of superior design, training, and tactics. Each new Japanese pilot sent into battle was less experienced than the last. By contrast, U.S. training schools turned out airmen drilled in combat discipline, deflection shooting, and teamwork. The Hellcat was forgiving. It could take punishment, correct a stall, or belly land on a carrier deck and still fly again the next morning. It made average pilots good. It made good pilots deadly. And it made aces like McCampbell, O'Hare, and Vrashu legends. But for the Japanese, the humiliation ran deeper. Intelligence intercepts revealed disbelief. Captured pilots spoke in quiet tones about the blue monsters, aircraft they said could not be shot down, that came from above like ghosts. The once proud Imperial Navy was reduced to conscripting boys with barely 100 hours of flight time. By early 1945, the kamikaze attacks began, a tragic symbol of desperation. The Zero, once the pinnacle of aerial dominance, was now a flying bomb. Hellcat pilots faced them daily, men willing to die to score a single hit. Over Okinawa, the sky became a furnace. Kamikazes dove out of the sun, engines screaming, wings aflame. Hellcats clawed upward to meet them, turning each suicide run into a duel of seconds. For every kamikaze that broke through, 5 were cut down by the Hellcat's relentless patrols. Lieutenant John W. Jack Quinn, VF-9, recalled one such day. You'd see them coming, a white cross of sunlight against the sea. You'd fire, keep firing, until the whole sky filled with burning wings. Some made it through, some didn't. But we were always there. The Hellcat was always there. By VJ Day in August 1945, the numbers spoke for themselves. Out of 12,275 Hellcats built, only 270 were lost in air-to-air combat. The rest had done their work, sweeping Japan's vaunted air power from the sky, one engagement at a time. When the war ended, American pilots flew victory laps over carrier decks. The blue shapes of Hellcats gleamed under the Pacific sun, scratched, patched, and scarred, but unbroken. They had started as the object of ridicule. Now even their enemies bowed to the truth. The Hellcat had done what few machines ever could. It had changed the balance of an entire war. September 2, 1945, Tokyo Bay. Aboard the USS Missouri, the gray dawn was still, the air heavy with the scent of oil, salt, and history. The Japanese delegation moved silently across the deck, their shoes clacking against the steel, their faces drawn and unreadable. Nearby, sailors stood at attention, white uniforms immaculate, eyes fixed on the horizon. Above them, in perfect formation, a group of F6F Hellcats and F4U Corsairs droned over the bay. A final, thunderous salute to victory. Lieutenant James Jimmy O'Neill, who had first seen combat in his Hellcat 2 years earlier over the Philippine Sea, stood by the rail and watched them pass. The same deep growl of the Pratt Whitney engines that had once filled him with fear now felt like an old friend's voice. He'd survived 23 missions, downed 5 enemy aircraft, and seen the arc of the war bend from terror to triumph, carried every step by the same rugged, blue-winged beast. When he looked up, he could see it all again in his mind. The sweat on the gun sight glass, the smell of cordite and seawater, the shudder of the plane when the guns opened fire. He could still hear the laughter, The dismissive, mocking laughter of those who had once called the Hellcat slow, clumsy, unworthy of the skies it would one day rule. They weren't laughing anymore. After the war, the Hellcat returned home not as a relic but as a myth made real. Pilots told stories in bars, classrooms, and hangars. Stories of impossible climbs, miraculous returns, of aircraft that landed on shredded wings or limped home with engines torn apart and still refused to die. In the hangars of the Pacific, mechanics whispered that the Hellcat had a soul. It always brought its pilot home. For the Navy, it was more than a fighter. It was a revolution in doctrine. The Hellcat proved that air superiority wasn't about speed or grace alone. It was about reliability, strength, and the brutal mathematics of survival. Every bolt, every piece of armor, every ounce of power had been placed with a purpose: to turn human skill into unshakable advantage. And that advantage became history. 19 enemy aircraft destroyed for every Hellcat lost in air-to-air combat. 75% of all Navy aerial victories in the Pacific credited to Hellcat pilots. Over 5,100 enemy planes shot down, more than any other Allied fighter. In Japan, captured engineers studied the wrecks left behind. One report recovered after the war contained a single sentence scrawled in disbelief: "They built a Zero that cannot die." As the 1940s gave way to the jet age, the Hellcat faded from the carrier decks it once ruled. Its engines fell silent, replaced by the shriek of F-9F Panthers and F-86 Sabres. Many were scrapped, their metal recycled into the new machines of the Cold War. A few were sold to civilian pilots, painted silver, and flown in air shows, the ghosts of a vanished era. Yet the legend endured. Every pilot who had ever strapped into a Hellcat remembered its smell, that blend of hydraulic fluid and hot aluminum, of cordite and sea wind. They remembered its steadiness in a storm, its refusal to quit, and the quiet confidence it gave when the odds looked impossible. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't glamorous, but it was, as the Navy would later call it, the plane that broke the back of the empire. Back in Tokyo Bay, O'Neill watched as the Japanese envoys signed the surrender. The sun broke through the clouds, glinting off the Missouri's guns and the folded wings of the aircraft resting silently on nearby carriers. He thought of the men who hadn't come home, those who had vanished into fire and sea, and of the strange machine that had carried him through it all. He whispered to no one in particular, "You did good, old girl. You did real good." Above him, the last flight of Hellcats passed overhead, sunlight flickering across their wings. The sound of their engines faded into the distance and not gone, just resting. From the day the Japanese laughed at its ungainly bulk to the moment it swept their Zeros from the sky, the Hellcat story had come full circle, not just a tale of machines and battles, but of human grit, design, and redemption. The Pacific was quiet again. The war was over. And somewhere, beneath the endless blue, the legend of the Hellcat purred on, a sound that would echo in history forever.